Some of you may be well familiar with this subject, and some of you may be recently learning about the Shakers. So please feel free to ask questions if you'd like me to clarify something. In my book, Imagining the Shakers, I write about how the visual culture of Shaker life was pictured in the popular illustrated press of 19th century America. These illustrated newspapers and magazines pictured the printed images we now recognize today as the visual evidence of what Shaker villages looked like and how Shaker life was conducted in the years before photography became commonplace in those communities. In the process of writing the book, I had the happy experience of encountering some of the original sketches the artists made in preparation for turning their drawings into published prints. Generally, these preparatory drawings function as rough drafts and get discarded when the prints that derive from them are completed. And so in these few surviving drawings, we get to see what the artist was observing and thinking at first hand while he was actually on site, and how these quick impressions were subsequently modified by the engravers back in the studio into the scenes we know today. So what I thought I should talk about today is a little vignette from the larger book, which is called 4 Surprises from the Artists Who Visited the Shaker Communities and Made Sketches from First-Hand Observation. First one is John Warner Barber's Gazetteer drawings from the 1830s. Gazetteers are dictionaries of geography. And John Warner Barber was an engraver and local historian in New Haven, Connecticut. And in the 1830s, he set out to describe every town and village and city in the state of Connecticut, and including the community at Enfield, Connecticut. So when I say that these are well familiar pictures, here is one that everyone, those fellow toilers in the vineyards of Shaker Studies have seen this. If you are new to the Shaker world, this is a petite little engraving. It's 2.5 inches high by 3.5 inches wide. So Barber never really imagined us looking at it with a full screen like this. And he considered the Shaker community, or each of the families in Enfield, Connecticut, as a village, just like the neighboring villages in Connecticut. So it ranked its own description and its own illustration. Not every town in Connecticut got an illustration, but this is the illustration that he published in 1836. It started out, excuse me, it started out as a drawing. These drawings are now in the collection of the Connecticut Historical Society. And you can see that he's just made a sketch and then scribbled his notes all over it. So not high enough here, the gambrel roof building. Broader, the building behind it. Church family, men and women, about 100. There's a structure back here, and he just wants to remind himself that it's only a barn. Walk to door. Here he is included on the road out in front of the village, a little stepping block for when you hop out of the carriage, you can step down from that. Over here on the right is a carriage shed, And down the bottom, you can see a plan of the village. He's laid out where all these buildings stand, because he's going to go through a few more iterations before he finishes up. He thinks, well, how about some elm trees in the foreground? That would be nice to kind of decorate the view. And there it is, church family, and the building is broader and it is higher. And look, here in the foreground, you see these two guys, a large figure and a small figure, are standing out in front. This is a little meme that he will continue to use in all of his gazetteers as he goes along, putting human figures in the foreground for scale. I'm not sure if these are supposed to be Shakers, but they help us see the scale of the buildings with the scale of the road in the foreground. So here's the second drawing. His third stage of this was to create a wash drawing. And that really was the vehicle by which he then did his own engraving. And he really knew what he was getting to by the time he got to this third stage. So not only do we have the elm trees all leafed out, but there's a guy with a wheelbarrow. And I think that he's a Shaker. And he's dressed a little differently from these other two, who seem to have their walking sticks and maybe their knapsacks hanging over their shoulders. So don't know, maybe they're Shakers with rakes, who knows? But the guy on the right is clearly dressed differently. He's working with the wheelbarrow at the Shaker Village. So here are the stages, and over on the right, you can see that the carriage house now really is fully developed as a carriage house. And out back, the barn, he has finally articulated with vertical siding and no windows, so that's clear. And this is the way it's going to end up in the little engraving in the Gazetteer of the state of Connecticut in 1836. He made this drawing, made these drawings in the fall, in October of 1834, so they really do qualify as the very, very first drawings made of a Shaker village for publication. There is a village of Canterbury, New Hampshire, a picture of Canterbury, New Hampshire, that appears in 1835. So the first published view is of New Hampshire, but the drawings, the preparatory drawings for these little woodcuts actually precede everything else. 1834, published in 1836. The same is true as of Hancock. Here's the Gazetteer of Massachusetts, the towns of Massachusetts, published in 1839. And this is the earliest printed view of Hancock. And it's one that Hancock Shaker Village has used. Just, it's ubiquitous. Everyone has seen it on every publication from Hancock. And there's the guy with the over his shoulder, rake, walking stick with his bandana full of lunch, who knows, on the back. And once again, it's just so unfair for us to be looking at this thing, filling our computer screens, because Barber really meant it to be 3.5 inches wide. Here is the preparatory drawing for that view of Hancock. And you can see again how he's just making notes to himself. The big note on here is drawn on the lower right. That means, you know, he has finished the work for this and it's ready to go to into the engraver. But look, you know, here is the church, here's the meeting house, and up above it with a line down, it says church house. And over here, brick red, pointing to the dwelling, built 102 feet long, 53 feet wide. And then here it says road, and then tangled up on all the stones, it says stone wall, you see? And out in the back, it says wooded. And then here is here's the barn, and how interesting to see that barn with a pointed roof instead of a monitor, as we've seen it rebuilt later in the 19th century. So here are little surprises, little stories of what the artist saw on site, what he was thinking and what he was taking away before he went home to the studio and started to create finished drawings, or finished drawings and the finished engraving that we're all familiar with. Here's what it looked like when it was fresh and done on site. Did I say that the drawing for this is at the Massachusetts Historical Society? The second group I'd like to make reference to is Benson Lawson's drawing of Mount Lebanon in 1856. Lawson was the chief engraver and what Harper's called a special artist for a number of Harper's publications, including Harper's New Monthly Magazine. Harper's really led the way. By the early 1850s, they had figured out how to combine text and print on a page like this, and just to mass produce them. They're much bigger than the small engravings that preceded them on the Gazetteers. And by the time this article appeared in 1857, Harper's claimed a circulation of 100,000. So this is the way 100,000 people got to learn about the Shakers. He arrived there, Lawson did, in August of 1856, apparently by invitation, because they received him and put him up for the night and gave him a tour guide to walk through the village. I think that by now the Mount Lebanon Shakers were beginning to learn how to use the press to their own advantage, not just to be the passive recipients of whatever kind of publicity came along, but rather to advocate. The Shakers could advocate in the press and thereby attract converts. And so they brought him in and they allowed him to see not just the meeting, which is, everybody's got a picture of a Shaker meeting by 1856, but they allowed him to see the back of the house, you might say. They allowed him to see scenes that were closed to visitors. Particularly, we like this image of the meeting house before it was, or when it is not being used in meeting. So there is his tour guide. There is Isaac Newton Young sitting with his coat tumbling down behind him and just waiting on a meeting house bench while Lawson sketches the interior here with a great door down at the brothers' end open and sunlight flooding in, and a little sort of a strange lump on the wall here. But we recognize the pegboards around the room. We recognize these great iron stoves with stovepipes running the length of the room to heat the rooms before they exhaust the smoke. So this is one of those scenes that's been often repeated. It's the earliest interior view of the complete meeting house, not just the little sketches we see in the dance prints, but really an accurate view of what it looked like. And we call it accurate because here is his sketch of it. Now, it's a little strange because upside down on the other side of the page, he has done an elevation of the windows and made little notes about where all the things are on the windows. But down below on the other side of the page, the one we've got right side up now, we see him sketching all the interior woodwork and the great wonderful sweep of that bow roof. And whoa, do we see what's happening over here? That little lump turns out to be a clock. Who knew? When I say there is surprises from the sketches, that's what I'm talking about. Because this is made on site, this is made from life, and in time that clock will disappear as the sketches go through the process of becoming engravings and are published. Door here is closed. Apparently he liked it open in the print. And look, it says pine. It says wainscoting. Wainscoting is the paneling at the bottom of a plaster wall that keeps you from smacking your chair into the soft plaster. Pegs. He's making these little notes to himself. He didn't really suppose that we would ever see this. So he's just scribbling his little guide to his finished drawing. Interior view of the meeting house from the women's side. Walls are a robin's egg blue, wainscoting of white pine, varnished, floor of yellow pine from Barrington. Doors, deep ultramarine, inside and out. Outside of the meeting house is white. He just kept everything, Lawson did, and after his death, it took 4 auctions over the course of many years to disperse his library of his writings and his drawings. And many of these materials were acquired ultimately by the Huntington Library out in Pasadena, California. So this drawing is out there. After his visit in August of 1856, and before the publication of his article in July of 1857, Lawson took this show on the road. He gave public lectures, and he created these watercolor views of his drawings. It may be that the watercolor views were what he needed to really remind him of the scene he had witnessed and to help him transform them into wood engravings. But I wonder also if he created these scenes, these watercolors, to help illustrate his talks to the public, because he, as I said, lectured about his visit to the Shakers. So in this watercolor view, doors back open, there's somebody standing in it. Sorry to say, the clock has become a lump again, but we see well articulated now the cast iron stove against the varnished wainscot. And when he says robin's egg blue, this is what he's talking about. This is the visual evidence of what that wall looked like when the building was 32 or so years old. He's marked all these watercolors with the date of his visit. This is August 18th, 1856, but there are a number of them. And so I don't know that he did every single watercolor on the 18th of April. I have a feeling that he's referring to the date of his visit. I'm sorry, I said April, but I meant to say August. 18 of his wood engravings made it into print in the article. Presumably there were some that got left on the floor, cutting room floor, but here is another fave of the new meeting house of 1823, the great bow-roofed meeting house. And in the background is the old meeting house of 1786 or thereabouts. Which was certainly big enough for the early Shaker family. But as the community at Mount Lebanon grew, they outgrew that and then had to build the new one. So, and so he's got new and old in the same engraving. But in the illustration, we see something that I'm not aware of having been recorded anywhere else. We remember that in the 1845 rules and orders published throughout the communities by the lead ministry, and for those of you who are new to the Shaker study, I might just say that there were rules that were attempting to keep everybody organized and in the same, on the same page across number of far-flung communities, although with mixed success. Lots of people did not obey lots of these rules. But one of the rules said, only the meeting house shall be painted white. And look, there's the meeting house painted white with the ultramarine doors. And because the old meeting house, the gambrel roof meeting house behind it, is now used as a workroom for the garden seed industry, it's no longer painted white, it's yellow. And of course, except when I talk about visual evidence, this is what I mean. That this is just the clue that I haven't seen written down anywhere else, haven't seen written down, that exists in my experience only as a bit of visual proof here, artifactual evidence. He was among the first, virtually the first, to picture Shaker costume. And here we have a picture of two sisters, one on the left, an outdoor costume. You see the bonnet and apron, and she's ready to go out of doors, and one an indoor costume. She doesn't need a sunbonnet. She's got a letter in her hands. But when we look at his watercolor view, whoa, it turns out it's the same sister in the same Shaker chair. He's had her pose twice. It tells you something about how much the Mount Lebanon Shakers were going to accommodate him, that they asked the sister to go in and change and come back out and sit again for a second sketch. Problem, of course, with this is that they look as though they're kind of estranged. They're not relating to one another. So when it got back to the engraving room, they flipped them and had them in conversation, or at least in connection with one another, which makes for a better composition. But when I say here are some surprises from the original artwork, that's what I mean. I didn't realize that this was the same sister sketched twice. Arthur Boyd Houghton was a celebrated London artist. He was a member of the Royal Academy and did lots of paintings that got rave reviews. And in 1869, he came to America to illustrate life for the London Graphic. And one of his first stops was at Mount Lebanon, where he recorded little sketches in a little sketchbook. Here is a student of mine at the studying abroad in London for the year, who went to the Victoria and Albert Museum and photographed the size of this sketchbook. It's not a very big sketchbook, and it contains just little rough sketches. And that's how he worked. These were small enough, the sketchbook and the sketches, to fit in the palm of his hand, so he could stand back and not intrude and not wave around an easel and take over the place, but just connect directly with what he saw in a very unobtrusive way. And so he's got shakers, hood, gray, brown, little character studies, and that's what he excelled at. And then later, back in the studio, these got run up into engravings. So those little sketches we saw were the dress rehearsal for a finished engraving. ABH stands for Arthur Boyd Houghton. In the London Graphic in 1870, by the time that they were published. Some of these scenes will be quite familiar to people who have books or have been to exhibitions about the Shakers. Here is meeting in the meeting room at the North family up at Mount Lebanon. Houghton left behind 3 young children to travel to America, and you could just see it was just hurting his heart to be away from his babies. And so we see a picture here of the 3 young children carefully attended by Shaker's sisters, 3 young girls. And in his little sketchbook, there we have it. There are the 3 girls facing in the other direction with their Shaker sisters behind them and a guy, a Shaker brother, behind the sister. And there they all are. There's the guy, there's the sisters, there's the children. But this drawing was not the drawing that informed this print in the final stages was not made at in meeting. He was sitting there very carefully, staying out of the line of fire, just recording these little vignettes. And here is Elder Frederick Evans. He's the best portrait in the room. There's a few more faces here we can see, but Elder Frederick really is the star of the show. And you can see in the sketchbook why that is. His image is much more detailed than anyone else's. So there he is, 6.5 feet tall, and the dynamic elder in that community, clearly interacting directly with Arthur Boyd Houghton. And this was such a good portrait of him that 2 years later, when Elder Frederick went on a proselytizing mission, went on a recruiting trip and a lecture tour in Great Britain, the graphic newspaper illustrated his trip as well. But they just took a shortcut. They just took that picture of him, created a scene, an imaginary scene, and used the same face. Those people here today who are students of Shaker furniture, I think, are looking at those chairs, those great hulking lumps of wood, and thinking, I don't think so. These are not Shaker chairs. And they're absolutely right. These are not Shaker chairs. But 3 years later, back in England, when this was engraved, close enough for the London engraving room, the important thing was the children here and Elder Frederick's face. The fourth group of images that I was fortunate to run across are a few drawings from the Joseph Becker article in Frank Leslie's Illustrated Monthly in New York, published in 1873. Joseph Becker got to Mount Lebanon just a few weeks after Arthur Boyd Houghton. He was there in March, and 3 months. And it may be that these were just too close, that the graphic published its illustrations so soon, and co-published with the American correspondents here in American newspapers called Every Saturday, that that the Joseph Becker sketches were delayed for 3 years before they were published. And they came out, it looks like this. Frank Leslie's Illustrated Monthly, in the manner of 19th century publications, had a story about the late Dr. Spring, and there's Dr. Spring. It's got nothing to do with the Shakers. But then running down that column on the right is Becker's article called The Shakers. Becker, like Lawson, was called a special artist, and that's the term they used for somebody who both wrote the story and made the pictures. It was quite a demand, and so not everybody was up to writing and drawing at on the same article. I think the modern equivalent might be a photojournalist. These are the years before there was such a thing as a photojournalist. So here is the schoolroom at Mount Lebanon. And Becker, started out his life as a Civil War correspondent as a kid. His professional life, he grew into this. His job was just to record what he saw without prejudice, without editorializing. And so it's a nice little picture here of this these guys at the school desk, these two boys in the Shaker School. We remember that that boys and girls were taught separately in separate seasons of the year. So here's some kids sitting there, standing there reciting, and here's a couple of guys at a desk. This desk looks very much like a couple of desks that we know today, one in the collection here at Hancock. And this, you know, kind of ratty-looking 14-year-old is, I mean, ratty behavior. He's a nice-looking kid, but he's just, you know, poking around, looking around, and it's such a nice kind of a vignette of ordinary teenagers, the kind of thing that the Shakers could point to and say, we have a great place here for raising children, and this spirited-looking boy in the foreground is no worse than any other 14-year-old. This is an okay place. Great to see, in addition to the desk, the alphabet board up here for the young children to work on, to learn their letters. When Joseph Becker retired, he seems to have hung on to all of these drawings. He retired at the turn of the century when photography was supplanting all of the illustrations for these illustrated newspapers, these, which is to say, pencil illustrations and wood engravings. And he seems to have hung on to these for no particular reason, other than he just liked the drawings that were coming out of his studio. By the end of his life, he was managing the entire illustration department. So there were hundreds upon hundreds of these that he brought home in boxes. And they were in the attic. And he showed them to his kids, and his kids strewed them around and played with them. And after Becker's lifetime, his children's children played with them. I mean, this went on for a long time, well into the end of the 20th century. They got kind of beat up, as you can see. But here is his drawing for the schoolroom. You can see the alphabet boards there. It's in place. You can see the shared desk. You can see the guy turning around here. It's all there, but it hasn't been as completely articulated as it will be in these final drawings. The illustrations, and there are a number of them here, were so plentiful that they were published in 4 installments in Frank Leslie's illustrated paper. And so after a while, they began to gang them up on pages. Here at the very bottom is a scene in the kitchen of a church family dwelling. So we can see here a brand new, modern, elegant cook stove. This is a modern place. This is going to be a great sell to people who are thinking of coming to live in the Shakers for the quality of life, or to send their orphaned children here as a good place to live. Not quite clear what this block here is with a descending a line from it, but we can see all of the pots and pans hung on the wall. Somebody in the next room is washing up here. And used, I mean, this is how ephemeral these things were. Once they had gone into print, they were called used. He scribbled used on them and tossed them in the box. They were of no use to anybody anymore, because what was important was the wood engraving that ended up in the paper, and these were of no use. These were ephemeral and discardable. Well, so in the finished drawing, we can see what this strange thing is in the corner. It's the pump. And here's some coopered woodenware. And so we pump water into the sink here. And now we can see much more clearly in the back room all these storage of plates and spoons and pans hanging on the wall, and dishcloths drying. Nobody saw this coming, but this illustration pictures a kitchen in the church family dwelling, and as we remember in 1875, the dwelling burned to the ground, and all of this was lost. So here we have the record of what the church family dwelling kitchen looked like before the devastating fire 5 years later. In September of 1773, here's pictures that we really hadn't seen before. A scene in the office where outsiders, people like us, were coming to do buying and selling, and selling window glass or something to the Shakers, and buying Shaker chairs to take away. Here's the outside of the retiring rooms, the sisters' room and the brothers' room. And then here is a scene in the brothers' retiring room. It was cold in March. You can see that because they've still got the wall blanket up. You see how the blanket that surrounds the room is just insulating that plaster wall. And it has such peculiar elements here as a stove with 2 stovepipes. And for the life of me, I don't know why that is. The stove wouldn't work very well if it were venting from both sides, but it doesn't appear to be going through the floor to the room below to vent something. So, mystery to me. Nice to see the broom and the brush hanging on the wall. Nice to see the wheels on the bed so you can pull the beds out from the wall to work on them. His drawing for this includes all of those elements, the brush on the wall and the wall blanket, but you see what we learned from this drawing. There in front of the stove, warming himself, is the tour guide, is Becker's, the man who accompanied, the brother who accompanied Becker through the village. So there's a great portrait of that stove with his superheater on the top, and there's a great portrait of the tour guide waiting for Becker to finish up his sketch. But did anybody pick up on this? Look at this. Back in Manhattan, somebody thought it would be a good idea not to have the brother sitting by himself in the room, but to add a second brother to the room. That wasn't the way it happened when Becker was there in March of 73. I'm sorry, March of 70. He and the tour guide were the only people in that room. And for whatever reason, maybe because somebody thought it was a better composition, maybe because it was a verity of Shaker life that people were not often alone anywhere in the village, somebody decided to paste that guy in. But here's a second brother. So when I talk about little surprises that we encounter from the sketches, that's what I mean. Well, okay. In closing, I just wanted to make reference to this picture of the singing meeting. It's a phenomenon that is well known in Shaker literature. It's a secular event every week, just for conviviality. The sisters and the brothers would get together. There'd be a list of approved topics they could talk about, current events if they were not too scary, sing Shaker songs. And that's what's happening here. Everybody's got their mouths open and the guys are all tapping their hands on their thighs and tapping time to the song. But over on the other side of the room, the sisters just are the scrawniest, meanest looking, pinched-faced people. It's just such an unkind picture of Shaker's sisters. So unlike Becker, who didn't make fun of people. He just recorded what he saw. And those faces just are so unattractive and so off-putting. So when I say we've got some surprises, here is the last of the surviving Becker drawings. There are only 4 of them. And when we look at it, everything's there. The carpet beneath their feet is there. The Shaker rocking chair is there. But look at those faces. These are nice people. These are friends of ours. These are people we would like to sing songs with. So I should say that after a century of being beat up on the attic floor of the Becker households, the Becker family came to the realization that these things might have value for the future, and they are now at Boston College, where a major exhibition was held 10 or so years ago of Joseph Becker's drawings, starting with the Civil War and going through to the end of the century, including these four rather beat up drawings of the Shaker meeting, that the union meeting, the social meeting, that tells us, we reached back to Joseph Becker's visit. We can see what he saw, and without the intervention of somebody in Manhattan who thinks they know better than the original artist. These are on-the-site drawings, on-the-spot drawings. And if we look closely, we can learn a little bit more about Shaker life in the years of its greatest vitality. Okay, so I'm going to hit the button that says Stop Share. And Sarah,
Yep.
Did anybody have anything to say, or have they all gone home to supper by now?
We do have a few questions, if you're up for it, Rob. And I will say that I think this talk is fantastic, and I think so many of us in the field just look at these engraving so often and just imagine that they were created to sell papers one day and then line wastebaskets the next. And so it's really wonderful to see some insight through the artist's eyes into these scenes. And one of my favorite anecdotes that you mentioned on Tuesday when we spoke, that you didn't mention today, but I guess everyone can read it in the book, which again is Imagining the Shakers, and it's Coupier Press, yes?
I'm sorry?
It's Coupier Press?
Oh, yeah, yep. The
So,
book published by Cooper Press at Hamilton College, yeah.
Yes, so if anyone would like to pick it up, recommended. But the artist who who was away from home traveling, illustrating, and put their three little girls in their images, which is, I think, a wonderful detail and also a nice reminder of the sentimentality that entered into these images, and not entirely unbiased, of course, as well, even though they were journalists. But to get to the questions, the first was from Jerry Grant, and he was wondering, did Barber do his own engravings?
Yes, hi Jerry. Yes, he was both an engraver and a local historian. He had been trained in New Haven by Abner Reed, and so after he got back, after a summer of just driving his carriage around, sketching every village in the state, then he spent the couple of winters, back doing his own engraving. Yep.
No surprise that question comes from our printmaker in the conversation. There was some conversation as well about the drawing at Hancock, that very well-known engraving. Jean was wondering, is it taken, or was it rendered from the vantage of Route 20? Because it appears, the brick dwelling appears to be from Route 20, but she was wondering if it existed back then, or was it the artist's quote-unquote license?
It is on a stone wall. It's at 90 degrees to Route 20. I pointed to a little legend that said Rhode, and that's the present day Route 20 between the dwelling and the church. And this is a bit around the corner. It may be a farm lane. I don't know the landscape of Hancock well enough to know if there's a lane that goes up to the west at 90 degrees off Route 20, but he pictures it with a stone wall and what appears to be a visitor, not a shaker. So I'm guessing that that was some kind of a public passers-by.
And I should mention too, I didn't mention this at the beginning, if anyone has a question, please type it in the chat box and I will ask Dr. Emlen. We have one more, and Anthony is wondering, were these type of illustrations commonly done for picturing other utopian groups at the time, or were the Shakers a particular fascination?
In the 1830s, the Shaker villages, and that would include the next Gazetteer of Mount Lebanon, or of New York State, pictured every single village in town, and that included, but was no means specific to communitarian villages. By the 1850s, Harper's seem to have been drawn particularly to Mount Lebanon. And I'm not aware of any other illustrations in Harper's of other communal societies, but they've just, I mean, once a month for 50 years, there's a lot that I haven't looked at. In 1868, a British author came to visit in 67, and in 68 published a book called New America. And it is almost completely devoid of pictures and completely devoid of Shaker landscape views, but it goes on and on and on about all the great, strange, new, wonderful social structures in this new land in America. And so it talks about Oneida, talks about Mormons, talks about a number of communities, including the Shakers, although he loved the Shakers, and so he gave the lion's share of his text to the Shakers. And in no time at all, Arthur Boyd Houghton was on a boat to America to follow in his footsteps. And some of the text that Houghton uses is quoted from New America, and he pictures the exact same things that are described in New America. And then he went from there to Oneida. And so there are other communal societies there because the book New America was about communal societies. Mm. And later that winter, when Becker came, it was exactly the same thing, except Becker didn't kind of refer to the text. Becker just plagiarized the text from New America. So whole paragraphs are lifted in this American newspaper directly from that English book about what he was looking at. And then among the Becker drawings on the floor of the Becker family attic were discovered illustrations of his visit to Oneida. So yes, and the latter two instances that I showed, these illustrations do picture other communal societies.
And we have a couple last questions. This is a tangential question, although you may know something about it. Can you comment on the illustrations from medicinal packaging, which I'm assuming were commissioned by the Shakers?
Yes, because in my book, I just go through chronologically and talk about the various times and the various inspirations from the 1820s to the 1880s, the reason that people picture the Shakers. And by the 1870s and 80s, the Shaker medicines were up and running and needed publicity. And by then the Shakers were very media savvy. And in a journal at the Emma King Library at the Shaker Museum at Mount Lebanon, you will find a reference to a New York illustrator being there specifically for the purpose of drawing pictures of the herb industry. So there are 12 months of those catalogs selling herbs, and you'll see those 12 months pictured, or an illustration of the process of labeling, of harvesting, of packaging. And those were done, and we know when, because they say, here was the artist here on that day. Later illustrations about the herb industry at Mount Lebanon were copied from photographs. It was much easier just to make a line engraving copies a stereoscopic view. So later ones were made from photographs.
Very interesting. And Dennis, if you would like more information, feel welcome to email me and I can connect you with Rob, because it sounds like you're a font in that subject area. And we have one last question from Diane. Were there any images captured of the Shakers during the Civil War years, given that they're pacifists?
I do not know of any. There were none, well, there were images published during the Civil War years that were reprints of ones that were made earlier. Mm. But I do not know of any picturing the Shakers as they were from 1862 to 1865.
All right, well, I think that wraps up all of our questions, and it seems like a good time to bring this to a close. Thank you again so much, Dr. Emlen, for participating in this conversation tonight. And thanks to everyone out there, all 43 of you right now, for joining us. It has been a delight, and I am looking forward to continuing these conversations virtually. I think this is a great platform for us, so let's keep this going. If anyone has ideas, feel welcome to email me as well at curatorial@Hancock Shaker Village. Okay, thank you all.
What I say to my granddaughter is, live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper, everybody. Take care, be safe, be well. Bye-bye.